of the greatest fires in the history of Westeros began with a king's dream. That night at Summerhall, dragons were not born, kings died. And the man at the center of that fire was once a child who even hid his name. Imagine, in the farthest corner of the 7 kingdoms, at a point where dusty roads meet, a shaved-headed child is sitting. His eyes are purple-gray. He is wearing clothes that could be considered rags. Beside him, a large-built young knight, the dust of the road on his face, the hardness of labor in his hands. The two sit around the night fire. On the horizon, there is no castle, no throne, no crown. But the child sitting by that night fire will one day change the fate of Westeros. Aegon Targaryen, the prince whom historians call Egg, the last king who wanted the dragons to return, and perhaps the person who came closest to bringing them back. Tonight, we will tell how that child turned into a king and why a king set everything he had on fire. The story of the future King Aegon V Targaryen. History sometimes says goodbye, not to the person, but to the moment the person was born. Aegon Targaryen, in the year 194, was born not within the gloomy walls of Dragonstone, not at the magnificent tables of the royal palace. On an ordinary spring day, as the 4th son of Prince Maekar Targaryen. 4th, you can feel the weight of that number, can't you? The 1st takes the throne, the 2nd serves him, the 3rd is perhaps consoled with a piece of land, and for the 4th, only a name remains, and his name was Aegon. The name had been repeated so many times in Targaryen history that it had almost become meaningless. Aegon, who conquered the dragon, Mad Aegon, Burned Aegon. Each generation added a new story, a new tragedy, a new burden to this name. But the Aegon we are talking about now was born not to shoulder this burden, but to bend beneath it and hide, because Baelor Ivor Targaryen was the heir apparent prince at the time, and the court of Daeron III was covered by the shadow of this dark, charismatic, unhealthy prince. Aegon's father, Prince Maekar, was an ambitious man who always remained in the side story, and his mother was Diana Dane, a footnote more than a real presence, who passed into the pages of history with only a name. Egg opened his eyes to this world, into an atmosphere that carried not the scent of court intrigues, but of endless hopelessness. The little prince grew up, but growing up in the royal court, contrary to what is believed for many princes, is not all that glorious. The reign of Daeron III had passed in the shadow of illness, a succession struggle, and grayscale. The palace corridors were overflowing with mourning clothes. The early deaths of princes, the collapse of heirs, were living proof of how a dynasty shrank without dragons. Dragons, yes, the word that kept appearing like the constant, invisible shadow of this story. The last dragons of the Targaryens were gone now. They had died 100 years ago. The reason was still debated, but the result was not. Without dragons, the Targaryens remained only as a family with unusually colored hair and purple eyes. Perhaps there were embers in their blood, but there was no breath to ignite it. As little Aegon grew up, this is what he felt, the heir to a greatness. But that greatness itself had long since rotted, turned to ash, and mixed with the earth. That is why history had prepared the most unusual path of education for him. The hedge knight Ser Duncan the Tall, giant-like, raw and rough, but a man filled with honesty. According to what the Duncan egg stories tell, young Aegon seemed as if he had come upon this man by coincidence. The exact circumstances of the prince's escape from the court differ slightly in every telling. According to some accounts, it was Mykar's voluntary decision, so that he might learn the world. But however the truth began, the result was clear. The little prince shaved his hair and set out on the road, bearing his surname. His name was now Egg, just Egg, and the road would become his true father. Imagine Westeros, but not from royal maps. See it from the legs of a hedge knight, stretching from north to south, from east to west. These lands had an abstract beauty when viewed from a tower, but when you set foot on them, they would immediately slap their reality in your face. Muddy village roads, fields cracked by drought, bellies swollen from hunger, the tired eyes of women, tools with wooden handles that men carried with indifference. The true population of Westeros was not a few hundred nobles in the court. It was the nameless millions. Aegon was seeing them. Perhaps this was the greatest difference between him and the previous Targaryen princes. They had seen the people from the backs of their dragons, like small, insignificant herds that needed to be ruled. Aegon, however, walked among them. He ate their bread and sometimes slept in their stables. With the eyes of a child and in time with the understanding of a young man, he grasped what these people wanted, what they feared, and which laws crushed them. Ser Duncan undertook his martial training. Dunk was a harsh teacher. He himself had not received a noble education, a man hardened by the severity of Arlan of Pennytree, an old fighting master worn down by time. He taught him not the refinements of tournaments, but the realistic art of survival, not how to hold a sword, but why he would or would not draw a sword, not how to defeat an opponent, but how to avoid a fight, and perhaps more importantly, how to recognize a lord, which one's word would be kept, from which one's door he would return cold. Little Egg changed as the years passed, but that change came not with the polish of the court, but with the dirt of the road. He served as a squire at tournaments. He hid his identity, concealed his surname. The child who was once addressed as Egg in this time wove himself into the true fabric of Westeros. Every tourney field that trained a lord, every complaint told by a peasant, every poor farmer family encountered at the end of each winter, all of these were reinforcing something within him. The people were real, the people were suffering, and the system itself that caused this suffering had to change. This idea was dangerous. It was still dangerous, and years later, when he sat on the throne, it would continue to be dangerous. But for now, Egg was just a child. Beside Dunk, on a dusty road, he was walking toward the next town. The sun was setting. The earth had warmed all day, and now it was giving that warmth to the darkness. The air was heavy. It smelled of grass and dry soil. On the horizon, there might have been a light, perhaps an inn. And that child, his eyes on the horizon, kept walking. At the center of every great story, there is a relationship. Not only romantic, not only a blood tie. Sometimes the deepest bond is hidden in two people from two different worlds holding on to each other. Ser Duncan the Tall and Prince Aegon Targaryen. The partnership of these two represents, perhaps, one of the most beautiful paradoxes in the history of Westeros. Dunk was a man with no surname, of uncertain identity, most likely raised in the poor streets of Kingsgate, with his enormous stature, his rough hands, someone who acted thoughtlessly at times, but always honestly. For him, knighthood was not a rank. It was a way of life, and this way of life bound him to Egg. Egg, on the other hand, may have seen Dunk at first only as a tool. Sources are silent on this, but in time it is clear that this relationship turned into something much deeper. Was Dunk a father figure to him? An older brother? A mirror? Probably all at once, and none of them fully. Dunk told Egg the things knights do not say. He criticized a lord, honestly trusted his own instincts, and did what he believed was right, accepting the consequences. Egg internalized this form of courage, not only the courage of battle, but moral courage, the courage to tell someone to their face that they are wrong, even if they are powerful. But we also need to look at the heavy costs of this relationship. Other relationships also developed in Egg's life. Over the years, the journey of Dunk and Egg intersected with various lords, knights, and common people. Some helped them. Some tried to use them. Some, without even understanding what was happening, passed through their lives. Here, we especially need to wrap around the Blackfyre rebellions. Aegon's childhood and youth coincided with one of the most turbulent periods of Westerosi politics. The Blackfyres, the grandsons of Daemon Blackfyre, the bastard son of Aegon IV, and the nobles who believed in them, began repeated rebellions against the Targaryen throne. All of these rebellions took place in an atmosphere that Egg experienced directly. History is a bit scattered at this point, but it is known that in later years Egg carried the Blackfyre threat as both a personal and political burden. The matter of rivals was not limited to the Blackfyres. There were tensions within his own family as well. His father, Mykar's relationship with the royal court, the various ambitions and lives of his brothers. These formed the rugged family politics that were the true fabric of the environment Egg grew up in. Among Aegon's brothers, there were those who died at an early age, those who went down other paths, those who fell into discord with the court. Each brother's loss or distancing pulled Egg a little further forward in the line of succession, and this was not something he had planned, not something he had ever planned. Life rarely goes along the path we set. The turning points in Aegon's life came not from his own will, but from the deaths of others. Each new loss pushed him up one step, but these steps were paved not with flowers, but with mourning. With the death of King Daeron II, his son Aerys ascended the throne, but the kingdom was not actually in his hands. Aerys was a king buried in books and prophecies. Governance was most often on the shoulders of his brother Prince Maekar and Crown Prince Baelor, and then, at the tourney at Ashford, everything changed. Prince Baelor, the most promising heir of Westeros, died as a result of a blow he took in a duel. This was not an assassination, nor was it a war. It was an accident, but it changed the fate of the dynasty. Years later, when Aerys also died childless, the crown finally passed to Aeg's father. Thus, Maekar Targaryen became king. This was the beginning of one of the most contradictory periods of Aegon's life. Maekar was a hard man, a type of king who was disciplined, harsh, and saw emotionality as a weakness. His relationship with his son proceeded within a timid distance. The period Aeg spent for years as a hedge knight seemed to carry both his father's approval and his discomfort at once. Maekar's reign was filled with its own difficulties and ended early. Sources paint different pictures regarding the exact details of his period, but the result was undeniable. Maekar died, and the Great Council convened. The Great Council. This assembly, convened in the year 233, represented one of the rarest moments in Westerosi politics. Nobles and clergy came together and tried to determine the fate of the realm by a vote. In history, moments like these carry both hope and fear, because when power falls into a void, each of the hands that will fill it imagines a world of its own. And in that room, under the weight of that moment, the name of Aegon, Aeg Targaryen, came to the fore. But was Aeg there? Sources cannot provide a complete answer to this question. The full debates of the Great Council are not recorded in full detail in Fire and Blood either. What we know is this: in the end of the process, Aegon took the throne. Some candidates were rejected, some held weaker claims, some came with family trees stained by the Blackfire taint, and in the end, Aeg's name shone like the only option. A man who, as a child, had traveled on dusty roads, hidden himself, and grown up amid rebellion and mourning. Now, he was becoming king. What did he feel in that moment? History did not record it, but let us think. A past with his hair shaved, his identity concealed. Someone who had been Aeg for years now had to become King Aegon V. This transition was not merely a change of name. It was the end of an identity. Imagine, in the highest tower of the Red Keep, at midnight, a king sits, alone. Around him are papers, letters, petitions. A candle burns, its light flickering, its shadows long. Outside, the sounds of King's Gate come. A distant dog barking, the iron of the night watchman, the cold wind. This king has passed 50 years of age by now. His hair is silver white. His eyes are still the same purple-gray, but what is inside them is different. More tired, deeper, more anxious. This man is Aegon V. Targaryen, and the dark core of his reign was born from the gap between what a child imagined and what a king could accomplish. From the beginning of his reign, Aegon believed in deep reform. What he had seen on the roads had shaped him, the difference between serfs and free peasants, the arbitrary justice of the noble, the maester's limited access to health. All of these were the rotten pillars of the system in young Aeg's mind. These were the things he planned to change when he became king. But being the holder of the throne does not mean you can change everything. The resistance of the nobility was not momentary, but structural. The Lannisters, the Tyrells, the Tullys, the Northern Lords, each of these sought ways to protect their own traditions, their own prerogatives, the privileges won over centuries. Every reform edict Aegon issued was open to being debated, postponed, weakened in the back corridors of the court. A law could be written, but for that law to be enforced, reliable hands were needed, and those hands were not always there. Then the matter of dragons came, and this is where we enter the most tragic, darkest, and most controversial dimension of Aegon V's story. According to some accounts, perhaps according to many accounts, Aegon V developed an obsession: dragons. The power the Targaryens had lost for a century. The only tool that would truly secure the throne, force the reforms to be accepted, break the resistance of the nobility. Without dragons, the Targaryens were merely a family name. With dragons, they were a god of power. How much did this desire drive him? History does not give a definitive answer to this question, but the shadow of Summerhall falls very heavily over this question. Now let us look at this shadow. Summerhall was a palace castle rising in the hot and arid lands north of Dorne. It had been built as the Targaryen summer residence. Once its stones were bright, its walls broad, its gardens alive. But this palace took on a completely different meaning in the final period of Aegon V's reign. Sources contradict one another about the tragedy of Summerhall, or seem to have been deliberately left incomplete. What is known is this: in the year 259, something terrible happened at Summerhall. Fire, deaths, a great catastrophe. It is said that Aegon V undertook a ritual attempt to rebirth the dragon. A great fire, dragon eggs, perhaps ancient texts concerning Targaryen magic. The exact nature of this attempt is still debated among historians. According to some accounts, the king himself also fell victim to this catastrophe. But here we need to consider this. If this man, all the reforms, all the efforts at improvement for the people, all the humility brought by all those years as a hedge knight, if all of that truly existed, then what was Summerhall? Was it madness, desperation, or a last resort that was consistent within its own logic? Had a man who wanted to obtain power without violence, but could not, tried to obtain power by supernatural means? And here, in this dark room, this question remains hanging, unanswered. Heavy, Aegon V's reign occupies a relatively calm place between the Great War periods of Westerosi history. Robert's rebellion was still very far away. The Targaryen dynasty was still standing. The Black Fires were finally being suppressed. There was no large-scale war in sight. But war is not always sword and arrow. Sometimes war is fought against the wall in front of a reform. One of Aegon V's greatest struggles was about improving the condition of hedge knights, expanding the rights of peasants, restricting the arbitrary power of landholders to punish. These were not bloody wars, but each of them was met with the resistance of powerful families. every law required a compromise, and every compromise was actually a defeat. What was the cost of this? For Aegon, it was a personal cost, the gradual whittling away of an ideal, sitting in the court and fighting with a pen, but the pen being followed each time by an eraser, and the matter of family. Aegon's children objected to political marriages, according to Fire and Blood. Some of his children refused marriages arranged with great nobles and married people of their own choosing. This was both a reflection of Aegon's idealism, and it was also creating a disastrous gap in practical politics. Marriage alliances that could not be formed with the nobility were leaving the throne without support. It is understandable that someone who loved the people would have supported his own children's free choices, but as a king, this luxury had a heavy bill. And there is also the matter of Grand Maester Aemon. Yes, that Aemon Targaryen, who joined the Night's Watch at Castle Black in the north, who lived for more than a century, Aegon's brother. But at this point, it is necessary to be cautious about the exact chronology of their relationship. Sources leave some gaps in the details of Aemon's joining the Night's Watch. What is known is that Aemon chose his duty at great cost, and whether Aegon was at peace with this decision remains a question mark. Losing one's family sometimes leaves a deeper mark than loss on the battlefield. The struggles Aegon V sustained throughout his reign can be characterized not by victory, but by persistent friction. The steps he took were small, but the direction was right. Legal changes were implemented slowly. Some of the arbitrary power of the nobility was broken, but the system as a whole stood firm. One man cannot change a system alone. Aegon internalized this lesson a little more with every year he spent on the throne. And did this internalization in time turn into a despair? Perhaps. Summits are deceptive. From the outside, a certain point in Aegon V's reign presents an image of relative stability and peace by Westerosi standards. The king is on the throne. The court functions. Great rebellions have been put down. The country is not drenched in blood. But a good king is not judged only by winning wars. He must be judged by how well he protects his people, whatever the conditions may be. And by this measure, the peak of Aegon V is a complex picture. Some of his reforms remained permanent. Regulations were introduced for certain conditions of hedge knights. A legal basis was provided for some rights of landless peasants. These were not small advances. They were tangible steps against a system of injustice built over centuries, stone upon stone. But the impression that remains at the summit is not only reforms, but also the texture of character. According to many accounts, Aegon V was truly a king who loved his people. This was not an image of propaganda. It was known that he had wandered nameless for years, lived outside the court, been shaped not by nobility, but by real life. For him, the throne was not an end, but a means. But how far could this means take him? Here is where the tragedy at the peak lies. The structure of Westeros is a fortress standing in the way of one man's good intentions. The Lannisters' gold, the Tyrells' grain, the Frey's bridge. These are not only wealth, they are power. And this power resists every reform because reforms take a share from this power. The peak of Aegon's reign, perhaps ironically, meant that he was at his most powerless. He had reached the peak because there was nowhere higher to go, and for those with nowhere higher to go, there was only one direction left. The name of that direction was Summerhall. The peak and the collapse sometimes intersect at the same point. History passes over this date with very few words, but what it does not say is far heavier than what it says. Summerhall, the palace north of Dorne, hot stones, wide courtyards, places once made to be filled with children's voices. Aegon V loved it. It made him feel a little freer, a little lighter. Unlike the cold stone corridors of the Red Keep, the walls of Summerhall seemed to carry the sun. What happened that day? Fire and blood and other sources seem unable to speak the full detail of this catastrophe without fear. Probably some information was deliberately censored or lost over time. But what is known in broad strokes is this: a great fire broke out at Summerhall. A significant part of the palace burned. Many people lost their lives, and Aegon V most likely lost his life in this disaster as well. We have to use the word most likely because sources are inconsistent and incomplete on this matter as well. But the general consensus is in that direction. Aegon V lost his life at Summerhall. Were dragons born? Did the magic work? Here, history is silent, completely silent. But there are things that are known. That day, there was a newborn baby at Summerhall. Rhaegar Targaryen, that child who would pass into history as the Dragon Prince, who would carry a great prophecy and sorrow, was born in the very heart of the fire. Think about this for a moment. As Summerhall burned, perhaps as dragons were being born, perhaps as a magic was taking place or collapsing catastrophically, a baby was crying within the ash. This scene holds all of Westeros's mythological images within it: death and birth at the same time, disaster and hope at the same time, the end of an age and the breath of another age. There is no record of Aegon V's final moment, of what exactly he felt, what he thought. Perhaps there did not need to be. Some moments are greater than what words can carry. As a child, he shaved his hair and set out on the roads. He buried his identity as a hedge knight. He learned the world. As a king, he fought for people. And in his final moment, as he tried to realize his greatest dream, he vanished into flame. Dragon, king, hero, all wrong, all right. Perhaps he was only a human trying to do the best he could, but for whom the world had no answer. But something came out of that fire, a crying baby, and that was enough. Summerhall burned. Aegon V ended. But one story did not end. One of history's paradoxical laws is this: sometimes the greatest legacy is shaped not by what is done while alive, but by the void left behind. After Aegon, his son Jaehaerys II ascended the throne, a short reign in an unhealthy body. And then Aerys too came, the Mad King, the man at whose name Westeros would flinch even while pronouncing it. We must stop here, because the distance between Aegon V's ideals and Aerys II's madness shows how quickly Westerosi politics can reverse. Within a single generation, there was a transition between a king who thought of the people and a king who burned the people. This reminds us of how fragile institutions are. Goodness is a trait of an individual, not of the system. Did any of Aegon's reforms remain permanent? Partly. Slow changes do not erase centuries-old traditions completely, but over time, they seep into the ground. The memory of the people sometimes remembers longer than official history. Aegon V's name, even after Robert's rebellion, continued to be remembered as the People's Prince, or with similar expressions. Within the tradition of knighthood, hedge knights found a somewhat more honorable place in his time. Ser Duncan the Tall became the head of the Kingsguard, Lord Commander. From the farthest starting point in the world, he rose to the most prestigious knightly position in Westeros. This in itself is a story, but within our story, this rise was a reflection of Egg's journey. Two men had changed together. One had a crown, the other a white cloak, but both had come out of the same dusty roads. And the ironic thing, both of them ended at Summerhall, most likely. Sources do not clearly record Dunk's presence and fate at Summerhall either, but accounts indicate that he was there as well. The giant and the egg, in the end, in the same fire. Rhaegar Targaryen grew up. The child born within that fire always carried a strange sorrow toward Summerhall. It is written that he loved it, but feared it. Music would play there, poems would be written, as if growing up on ash had given him a different melancholy. And from Rhaegar one comes to the matter of Lyanna Stark, and from there to Robert's rebellion. And after the rebellion, the Targaryens fell. Aegon V's grandchildren, in the strict sense, ceased to exist. But one remained, Jon Snow, or rather by his true name, Aegon Targaryen, Rhaegar's son, Lyanna's child. That young man who grew up in snow in the north joined the Night's Watch, carrying a great legacy without knowing anything. There was Aegon in his name. This was no coincidence. The Targaryens used names cyclically, but this time the cycle carried a deeper meaning. A name born from ash, Aegon the Fifth Targaryen. Egg, the child of dusty roads. The man who became king from a squire. The person who dreamed and, while trying to reach those dreams, burned away. History, what does it say about him? Fire and blood frames him carefully, but with sympathy. The memory of the people remembers him as a good king, even though we have limited information about him, and perhaps knowing little has provided him a kind of protection. To be known too much is to be exposed to the sanding stones of history. But tonight, we spoke not only about his life, we also spoke about what his life taught us. And now, let us name these lessons to be drawn from this life. First, ambition takes its meaning from its source. Aegon's ambition existed not for power, but for change. The same ambition, in a different heart, gives birth only to destruction. But, in the right heart, it tries to make the world a slightly more just place. Ambition is a tool. Its value is measured by where it is directed. Second, Every person who wanders between duty and dream is alone. Aegon both had to be king and imagined a better world. These two never fully fit together. Duty sets limits. Dream recognizes no limits. Living within this tension made him both great and tragic. Third, pride is visible on every face. The pride of the good is the most dangerous. Summerhall was perhaps the product of a pride, a well-intentioned but dangerous pride. I can do this. I can change the world. I can bring the dragon back. One must believe in the physical and magical limits of the world. Good intentions do not remove these limits. Fourth, love both strengthens and leaves one vulnerable. Aegon's devotion to Dunk, his love for his people, his care for his family, these were his strongest sides. But love is not always protected. Sometimes we lose those we love, and that loss either makes us wiser or more fragile. Fifth, fear is not an enemy. It points to a compass. Aegon knew what was wrong. The poverty of the people, the power of the nobility, the resistance before reforms. This must have frightened him. But he did not withdraw from fear. He walked toward the direction fear pointed to. Fear sometimes tells us what is important. Sixth, power gains meaning not when it is possessed, but in how it is used. Ascending the throne was not easy for Aegon, but the hardest part was what he would do on the throne. And he wrestled with this question throughout his life. Power is not an end. It is an opportunity. And how you make use of this opportunity determines who you will be in history. The stones of Summerhall are still standing somewhere, north of Dorne, burned, half ruined, but standing. And every summer, when the sun strikes those stones, perhaps there is something very small there, nameless, invisible, but real. The traces of a king as a child. His hair shaved, his eyes purple-gray, the traces of a child walking on the road. Tonight, we told the story of Aegon Egg Targaryen, and I hope this story has left the traces of something in you as well. If this narration added value for you, you can leave a mark below, a like, a subscribe. The history of Westeros is deep and dark, and we will continue to dive into this depth together. The fire does not go out, it only changes form.